Good morning and welcome to this policy forum, Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment, SEAH, in UN peacekeeping operations. Thank you, first of all, to the Elsie Initiative for Women in Peace Operations, led by Global Affairs Canada, for supporting this event and supporting IPI's work on this topic since 2019. We'd also like to thank our partners for today's event, the Office of the Special Coordinator on Improving the UN Response to Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, and the Gender and Security Sector Lab at Cornell University. It's been 20 years since the publication of my report, or formally the report on the comprehensive strategy to eliminate future sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. When we released the report, my small team of Tony Miller, Anna Schotten, and myself, we knew very well that either the report was implemented in full or something like full, or this odious phenomenon would continue to poison the UN long into the future. And while the Secretariat has taken a whole host of measures over the 2 decades, greatly improving its own technical and legal understanding of the key issues, the same cannot be said of the member states taken as a whole. From the very beginning, before we even had the opportunity to discuss it, the Fifth Committee at the UN, prompted by the EU, ignored our recommendation there should be a standalone investigative body, for example, and decided it should be with OIOS, something we opposed. No progress was made on a DNA database, and in situ court-martials did not become the norm. Worst of all, the draft convention sits idly in the Sixth Committee, a total disgrace. These are just a number of the more important remaining or extant issues. We're gathering today at an inflection point. This year marks 24 or 25 years since the adoption of the UN Security Council, its resolution 1325, which is an important milestone that invites both reflection and courage to envision an ambitious future of the WPS agenda. At the same time, the UN80 initiative is underway, aiming to reaffirm the UN's relevance and strengthen its impact in a changing or rapidly changing world. And most importantly, we must recognize the reality on the ground that global conflict is now at its highest level since World War II. For those of you who may be interested, I addressed the Security Council yesterday about what could be done to improve the UN's performance in the peace and security pillar in a style, let's say, that was unorthodox. You may want to have a look. All these moving pieces have created fertile ground for the UN to move beyond its normative commitments and implement robust institutional and systematic or systemic change. The UN is experiencing crises on many fronts, and violations such as SEA and sexual harassment are antithetical to its purpose and effectiveness as an organization. The next Secretary General will have the opportunity to prioritize the elimination of SEAH as a central tenet of her tenure. We are fortunate to have with us today an esteemed panel bringing together a range of perspectives spanning firsthand at the mission level and at UNHQ, as well as the critical insights of researchers who will share their findings on these issues. It's now my distinct honor to welcome Jacqueline O'Neill, former Women, Peace and Security Ambassador for Canada and current Director of Global Affairs Canada, who will provide opening remarks. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sade, for those very characteristically incisive and clear points. Bonjour à tous et toutes. Greetings to everyone from beautiful Ottawa, Canada, outside my window, maybe not yours. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir de pouvoir me joindre à vous. Please permit me to hopefully effectively cover all my bases by saying all protocols observed. As Canada's former ambassador and now director responsible for women, peace, and security at Global Affairs Canada, I have the pleasure of being responsible for the Elsie initiative for women, peace, and security, or for women in peace operations, which Canada founded to increase the meaningful participation of women in UN peace operations through advocacy, research, and partnerships with the UN, as well as with major troop and police contributing countries. Some of the research supported through the Elsie initiative includes, as you just mentioned, the two papers we'll discuss today, IPI's previous research on gender responsive leadership in the UN, and the gap analysis done by the UN Department of Management Strategy, Policy, and Compliance to gather data on sexual harassment among uniformed peacekeepers, as well as maps the UN's policies. We built this research component into the Elsie initiative because action on these issues is still, all these years later, very desperately needed and should be evidence-based, yet research and data remain woefully scarce. We also see that issues of sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment have for far too long been thought of as marginal or peripheral. In addition, of course, to being rights violations, they affect the very abilities of peace operations to fulfill their overarching mandates, meaning they impact the effectiveness and the sustainability of peace operations themselves. Among other consequences, they undermine credibility and acceptance among the populations they're meant to serve, and the confidence and the commitment of populations from which peacekeepers are drawn. And in Canada, we have come to understand the core importance of these topics through sexual misconduct crises within our own armed forces and police services. And as we navigated these national crises, a few things became very clear to us. And these are insights that Phoebe and colleagues have very much and very wisely highlighted in their research, including the fact that the root of these behaviors lie in the abuse of power, that abuses of power follow a continuum. They almost never start with rape, for example. They start with bullying, disrespect, sexist or racist remarks, which then escalate when they are either rewarded or tolerated. Tolerated, of course, meaning a lack of accountability. And we know that what is tolerated and what is rewarded, especially by an organization's leaders, define that organization's culture. There's still so much more that we all need to know and to learn, like how to maximize the effectiveness of training on these issues, what structures are needed, how to get more men engaged and seized with the topic, how to promote peace operations that are inclusive, accountable, and safe for all, and how to ensure that these topics are treated as the priorities that they deserve to be. So thank you very much to IPI, to our researchers, to today's panelists, and all else for helping us move in that direction. We very much look forward to listening. Merci.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Zaid. It's so wonderful to have you both here. My name is Phoebe Donnelly, and I lead the Women, Peace, and Security program at IPI, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm also the co-author of two of the reports we'll be talking about today. I want to start by thanking the Elsie Initiative for Women in Peace Operations, led by Global Affairs Canada, for their ongoing support of this type of work. Thank you as well to the Office of the Special Coordinator on Improving the UN Response to Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, and the Gender and Security Lab at Cornell University for their partnership on today's event. Thank you also to our amazing group of panelists. I think we're going to have a really insightful discussion. I also wanted to share that over the next year, we'll have several additional events and research launches related to our research in partnership with Elsie, so please do stay in touch. One of them we are going to quickly plug is that we are conducting a survey on gender bias in UN peace operations, and we're going to put the link to that survey in the chat for anyone who has served in a UN peacekeeping mission. It's really useful to have your support in this research by sharing your feedback. Today, we're excited to launch two recent publications. The first is Connecting Sexual Exploitation and Abuse and Sexual Harassment in UN Peace Operations. And the second is Training on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse for Uniformed Peacekeepers, Effectiveness and Limitations. These publications can be found on our website. They also will both be available translated in French. Additionally, this webinar has simultaneous French translation. For those of you joining us in Zoom, you can select the three dots at the bottom of your screen, hit more, and there's an option for interpretation. If you're listening via social media and you want to join for interpretation, please, we will be sharing a link, so feel free to join the Zoom. So we have our panel discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So please feel free, those on Zoom, to submit your Q&As in the option of the Q&A feature. I'm going to start by posing each panelist a question, and then they will provide some opening remarks. So I'm going to start first with the Undersecretary General and Special Coordinator on improving the UN response to sexual exploitation and abuse, Christian Sanders. We'd like to ask you, what measurable, tangible steps can UN leadership take both at UN headquarters and within mission settings to foster the kind of culture that prevents sexual exploitation and abuse? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you, Zaid. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Amanda. It's really great to be here, and thank you also to IPI for GSS and to the Elsie initiative for putting on these types of initiatives which improve awareness, and that's all part of the prevention and the protection of populations from sexual exploitation and abuse. So hugely important leadership. In the 3 years that I've been doing this role, I've traveled to all the peacekeeping missions. I've traveled to many of them on multiple occasions. And I've also traveled to many countries where we don't have peacekeeping missions. And I found that leadership is one of the critical elements that is often missing. And it is absolutely the difference between success and failure in addressing sexual exploitation and abuse. At headquarters, we need leaders to push to ensure that we have predictable, sustainable funding for this particular issue. That's, to my mind, that's one of the failures up to now. When we introduced the new strategy, we did so on a budget neutral basis. And I think we felt at that point in time that we could address it without additional resources. I think that was a mistake, and I think we need to rethink that. I also think that leaders at headquarters need to ensure that there are adequate resources at the field level in particular, and they need to ensure that their leaders, whether those leaders are at headquarters or in the field, understand the importance of this issue and prioritize it. I often say to people when I'm visiting the field, if there were 5 things that I had to prioritize as a leader in the field, this would be one of them. It's not going away. It's here to stay, and until society fixes the underlying issues, it's simply not going away. So we need to pay constant attention. Otherwise, it's going to continue as an unspoken secret. At the field level, it's important that that leaders talk about it and talk about it frequently. They need to be proactive. They need to be committed to this issue, and they need to pass that on to others within the field. So the resident coordinator, for example, would need to pass it on to the country team. The SRSGs, the force commanders, the police commissioners would again need to cascade it down through their leadership teams, right down to the bottom, so that everybody understands the issue. I was going to refer to the 2 papers because I think the 2 papers are important and have a link to leadership as well. In terms of why sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment have been kept separate in the UN Secretariat up to now, the logic for this was that when the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, came into office nearly 9 years ago now, he wanted to ensure that both received priority. So his idea was, if I keep them separate and I have dedicated teams working on both, neither one will be lost and they'll both receive priority. I think we've learned a lot since then. I think the UN used to view sexual harassment as an HR issue, and it was something that just occurred within the workforce, so blue on blue. I think that sexual harassment just happened between somebody who was serving for the UN and a member of the local community. I think we've learned a lot since since actually, Phoebe, I forgot to start my timer, so you'll have to stop me when I'm done. Um, Felt that sexual exploitation and abuse just happened between those serving the UN and the local community. I think we now know that sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment can happen to anyone at any time, anywhere. And it happens blue on blue. A good example of this is when, for example, a senior manager may say to a junior colleague, you know what, I'm not going to renew your contract unless you exchange favors. Sexual harassment, again, is something that doesn't just happen within the workforce. The other thing I think that is important to recognize is that we still don't have women in sufficient leadership roles, in decision-making roles. And we need to continue to push for that, particularly in the uniformed services, the police and the military, where largely I've found that women are relegated to the traditional sort of stereotypical female roles. And there is this sort of glass ceiling, I think, where people believe that that the highest that women should really attain within a peacekeeping operation is being part of community engagement teams. I think we've got to move beyond that and have women in all leadership roles in all peacekeeping operations. So I think the most important thing is, in terms of leadership, is that leaders are committed to this issue and that they're proactive in addressing it on a continuous basis. Now, just maybe in closing, the reasons I think that leaders are not engaged in this issue is, one, is no matter whether you were born in Canada, in the UK, in Jordan, or in Nigeria, we're all conditioned from a very young age not to talk about these issues. These are subjects that these are things that happen between consenting adults behind closed doors. It's a taboo subject, and people don't like to talk about it. And I think that is one of the major factors. People feel uncomfortable talking about it, and they don't talk about it. I think the second reason, and there are others, but the second reason is this is not a good news story. And leaders do not like to get close to this issue because it has the potential to derail their careers. The other thing I think in terms of leaders being close to it is we have a bit of a culture, both I think in the uniformed services and within the UN, of closing our eyes to these things and not taking action. And I think that's a huge mistake. I think when these things happen, you have to deal robustly with these issues, and you have to be seen to be dealing robustly with these issues. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for all those excellent points. I think that gives us a lot to discuss. I'm now going to turn to Deanne Rourke, who's a postdoctoral scholar at the Gender and Security Lab, my co-author. Deanne, if you could walk us through, based on the data analysis, how effective is UN SEA pre-deployment training for UN military and police personnel, and what are some of its limitations?
Yes, absolutely, Phoebe. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. As Phoebe just mentioned, I'm Dr. Deanne Roark. I am a postdoc with the Gender and Security Sector Lab at Cornell University. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings from our policy brief titled Training on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse for Uniformed Peacekeepers, Effectiveness and Limitations. And this is the co-authored brief between GSS and IPI. And the authors include Dr. Phoebe Donnelly, Dr. Sabrina Karim, myself, and also Dr. Muhib Rahman. And so the data for this policy brief actually come from the Measuring Opportunities for Women in Peace Operations project led by Dr. Sabrina Karim and overseen by the Gender and Security Sector Lab. And so these novel survey data represent more than 4,000 military and police personnel from 10 countries and 12 security institutions, which you can see within the table here on the screen. And the utility of these data, particularly for this study here, is that they represent equal proportions of both women and men, and also an equal split of personnel with and without UN deployment experience. And each survey is localized to fit each unique country context. And so let's jump in to some of the findings. And so, with respect to the effectiveness of SEA pre-deployment training, our statistical results point to four notable takeaways. First, we found that personnel who've participated in pre-deployment training on SEA are substantially more likely to know that SEA is a violation of their national security institution policy. These personnel are also more likely to consider SEA to be a serious violation of misconduct policy. And they're also more likely to say that they would report a colleague for committing SEA misconduct. And in addition to this, we also find that UN deployment actually increases the likelihood that personnel receive various other gender-related trainings beyond the topic of SEA. So, for example, you could think of training on institutional harassment or other specialized gender training topics. And so, taken together, these findings suggest that pre-deployment SEA training not only has a positive impact on personnel attitudes about SEA, but also that this professional development could contribute to broader institutional norm changes within military and police organizations. And so another notable takeaway from the modeled results points to the limited effectiveness of SEA pre-deployment training. And so as you can see here on the screen, the descriptive data show that only about 59% of peacekeepers within our sample reported that they received pre-deployment SEA training, and this is denoted in the blue portion of the pie graph here on the screen. And so this means that a significant proportion, about 41% of peacekeepers within the sample, reported that they never received SEA training before deploying to a UN mission. And this statistic is denoted in the orange here. And so we wanted to understand what explains these perplexing findings here, right? Because we know that there is a mandate to receive SEA training as part of the pre-deployment curriculum. And so we've identified a few possible factors that may explain this. Number one, it could be simply that personnel just don't remember the training, which means that it's not salient for them to recall. The second potential factor here is that we know that SEA training is mixed with other topics covered within the pre-deployment curriculum. So it's likely that there could be conflation happening between the many different topics that are being covered. And yet another possibility is that TPCCs simply might not be providing adequate training on SEA, which also plays into retention and salience, so personnel being able to recall what they've learned about SEA. And so given this, it's clear that there are challenges to the effectiveness of SEA training, and in particular, both the quality and the content of SEA pre-deployment training is impacted by factors like how much time is spent training personnel on SEA issues, the substantive content that's covered within these training sessions, and also the models or methods employed to teach personnel about SEA. And so there are some important implications to consider that could impact the effectiveness of SEA training. And so these include whether the delivery of SEA pre-deployment training is merely being treated as compliance-based, in which the bare minimum is being done in order to satisfy the training requirement. And so essentially in this hypothetical scenario, this means that SEA training could be treated as a box-checking mechanism. There's also the implication of the short duration but broad scope of training that may limit retention. And so, as you can think, receiving all of this information all at once very quickly is sort of trying to like drink water from a fire hose, just receiving a lot of information, a lot in such a short period of time, which can be difficult to parse through and later recall. And yet another potential implication here is that trainers may simply lack expertise. Importantly, however, regional training organizations are doing much to help overcome these challenges. First, the International Peace Support Training Center in Nairobi, Kenya, has taken an applied approach to SEA training. And so IPSTC employs a variety of different methods to deliver SEA content, so trainees have a more immersive learning experience. And the organization's SEA course is enriched with case studies that are analyzed in small groups, and they integrate numerous SEA-related video clips to deliver their content. So essentially, they work to diversify how personnel are receiving information, and so this influences how they're digesting the content being delivered. And so, with respect to their case study approach, personnel are actually given a realistic regional example or examples, which allow them to connect with and understand the seriousness of the message being delivered. And additionally, IPSTC has a realistic training village where they enact scenario-based exercises. And as one trainer explained, IPSTC has one scenario on conflict-related sexual violence and another on conduct, discipline, and SEA, where they try to test the understanding and application of participant knowledge. We can also look to the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping, and Peace Building to understand other best practices for SEA instruction. And so CCPA or CCCPA trainees are required to engage in applied learning methods by putting together short presentations on SEA to demonstrate what they've learned from the training. And for these presentations, trainees are given a scenario in which they're asked to speak to a colleague in their own battalion who actually opposes the idea of SEA training. And participants are then required to put together a message to convince them of the importance of this training. In addition to this, CCCPA also places a strong emphasis on cultural relevance in its approach to SEA training, reflecting the fact that meaningful learning and attitudinal change occurs when content resonates with participants' lived experiences and values. And so, to this end, the organization ensures that messaging is carefully tailored to trainees' cultural and social contexts to encourage learning. And this agenda is achieved by CCCPA's strategic use of culturally familiar narratives, examples, and values that align with the principles of SEA prevention and gender inclusion. And so overall, these multi-method approaches that regional training organizations are implementing help to emphasize the utility of SEA training and contextualize the importance of SEA curriculum to personnel's specific backgrounds and their role on mission. And so that's all I have for y'all today. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Hand it over to you, Phoebe.
Thank you so much, Deanne. And just to give a note, there's some other training centers mentioned in the brief, one in Ghana, one in Brazil. So we really tried to look at, amidst some of the critique, what's happening that's positive in other parts of the world all over. So there are ways to conduct this training in a way that's effective. I also wanted to flag that, with both of the papers Deanne and Evan are presenting, a lot of people's time and energy went into reviewing and filling out surveys and speaking with us, all the different trainers. So we're really lucky to have their time and grateful for all of the support that's given to produce these findings. So now I'm going to turn it over to get more of the field perspective. I'm thrilled to have Buki Awayemi, a Chief Conduct and Discipline Officer from MNERSO. And Buki, we'd like to ask you, what lessons can you share from your experience working within MNERSO? And can you highlight what can be done that you learned to prevent or address SEA? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. First, I need to explain what MNERSO means, because for people that don't know what it means, our name is United Nations Mission for the Referendum in Western Sahara. So acronym is MNERSO. What I do is the conduct and discipline, and part of my mandate is to ensure that I prevent SEA and sexual harassment and generally misconduct as a whole. So SEA is part of what misconduct is, and sexual harassment also, they're part of what misconduct is within the UN definition. So what I've learned throughout my stay in MNERSO, what has occurred and how we can prevent it is quite large, and yet we're trying to limit it so that we can effectively fulfill our mandate. One of the mandates we do is training. We train a lot. But then the question asked, when we conducted the data analysis, we find out that since 2003, there hasn't been no report of SEA in MNERSO. That brings up a concern, because someone might say, oh, that is okay. You don't have SEA, or you don't have, we do have sexual harassment, but I would come to that. SEA in itself, it's what you define as actual sexual exploitation. It's actual or attended attempt, abuse of a position of the vulnerability and differential powers, or trust in sexual purposes, or not limited from profiting from it. What does that mean? That actually means, as UN staff, we're here as peacekeepers, and we're here to deal with our beneficiaries. We might not be having war in Western Sahara at the moment, but we're still peacekeepers. That's the definition of what we come under. So therefore, everybody, every local person, national or visitor in Morocco or Western Sahara, Laayoune, where we are beneficiaries. We're here to make peace. We're here, this is what we do. So the moment a UN personnel, and UN personnel here consists of both the national staff, the international staff, military, we don't have a contingent, we have military experts, which we call military officers. And then we have UNVs who are volunteers in the UN, and we also have international contractors. So these together were UN personnel, and we're obliged to live under the UN standards. So there comes the question, why don't we have SEA? Why is the mission so different? It's not different. The problem we've identified is that people are afraid to come up and report what SEA is. The culture does not allow them to come forward, so we're limited. Unfortunately, what we get also, during my training, it's SEA does occur, but the issue that the personnel have held on to is that, yes, SEA is there. Your definition of SEA means, trying to rape someone or, trying to have an illegal affair. It isn't. SEA just means anything, sexual, mandatory, anything against a local person. So the definition of what does the consent mean? Because they come to me and say to me, oh, we have a consent, we're adults. So, this is a family mission. By the way, for people that don't understand how the UN is constructed, we have a mission that is family-based, meaning you can bring your partners, your children here. And for non-family-based missions, it means you can't bring it. It depends on the situation, and it changes as it comes. So my answer and what we've developed regarding that is, you must report. It is the obligation of the UN staff, UN personnel, to report SEA. Consent means no. That is one of the what is coming up in our next SEAH campaign. Consent is no. It means what happens if someone says, I don't want to do it again? What happens at that point, even though you're in that relationship and the mission has not said anything about that relationship? What do? It means no. It means it's an SEAH. Any relationship you have outside the mission is an SEAH. So it comes to the point when you say, yes, we know. Okay, now you've given us so much training on that, but there's still SEAH, but you have not done anything. We're trying consistently to keep training. And I find that when you're physically training people, you get better results from that than the mandatory training online that our staff members do. It's not effective. I can understand that, training in different between the military has been partially effective, but I find that it's not effective at all, because you find that people copy and paste. There's no monitoring. Nobody's monitoring your training aspect. So what do you do at that point? You copy and paste. It comes out on the data that we have 100% mandatory training. They've gone through SEAH, but it's not effective at all, because once you do that, what do we do with the data? When does the policy come in? We don't have the policy that is effective. The last policy on this is probably 2018 that we have. So this is about 6 to 7 years now. What has changed? The fact is that it's not effective. When you go, how do you manage it in your mission? When you physically go to the team site, we have about 9 team sites in the desert. When you go there, you get the military personnel. You're able to ask the questions. They're able to understand what it means to be in breach of SEAH, what it means to be in breach of sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment. I invited the Undersecretary General. It was here in May, so that participation in the training is effective when we have a leader as well that is there, is physically here. We went to about 5 team sites. We got information. We did a risk assessment of an area. We were able to discern and understand why we have not had so much report on sexual exploitation and abuse. There is a leader that's come all the way from New York, is an Undersecretary General. It's come and conveyed that message that it's a no-no. Any SEAH is a no-no. So we found that also that the definition of sexual harassment also has not been effective as well. What do you do with sexual harassment? In terms of your training, I've been training on this. Most of the sexual harassment cases we've had has been with the military officers. The civilians don't report sexual harassment for one reason or the other. The fact that their family are not there, the fact that the culture determines what you do also. So sexual harassment is basically, and the issue on that is basically, I have the consent, we're doing it. But when does the consent change to sexual harassment? I'll give you a clear example. We've had a case, this was about 5 years ago, so it's been decided on, of a UN personnel that for an European country that had invited a male colleague from a South Asian country where they practice massage, physical massage. She invited the personnel, the male colleague. He went to her house. They started this massage. And she found that after a point, because she had no top on, after the point, she felt something very odd on her back. And then she said to the guy, you have to leave. He left. But then she brought the case that this officer has come to my house. The officer is like, it was with a consent. But at that point, we had to determine what was it sexual harassment? It was sexual harassment, because consent also means no. So those are the practical examples of what we have and what we're doing. We're publishing magazines, Coffee Talk magazine. We've developed a QR code where you can read it, because we find that we don't have the permission, or we're restricted in communication with the local people. So how do we convey our messages? We're doing it by magazines. People can come in and pick up our magazines. Staff members can take the magazines home. We have constant, we have a box, where they can put their complaint in, so we can investigate properly. We're developing, which I think our mission is going to be the first to develop that. If we're developing augmented reality, where we're able to flash, cartoon messages, and just a little message that SEAH means no, you must stop it. So those are the initiatives we're programming, and we're hoping, as the data will be a reality, that SEAH is no longer existing. And as the USG has just said, we are expecting the leaders, which I have a SEAH task force made up of the leaders of the mission, where we meet, and I do a lot of training for them so that they can communicate it from top to the bottom. Managers can do that, tell us what the SEAH, train the staff members. In the team side, I have focal points for SEAH, within the military, and the local, we have the focal points as the managers of supervisors of each department. So we're encouraging them. We're doing a lot of campaign in the mission, and we're taking the data, we do the surveys as well, so that we can align where the risk is, what we can do. So hopefully we will promote a lot more of the results that we've done and what we're doing constantly. So welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Buki. Thank you for those really tangible examples and kind of sharing your challenges through that, and also highlighting the strong point that most of us who work on gender-based violence think about a lot is no reports doesn't mean no gender-based violence. So thank you again for all those examples. Looking forward to the Q&A. I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Evan Papworth, a policy analyst from IPI and co-author of this brief that looks exactly what Buki and we've kind of addressed, the connection between sexual exploitation abuse and sexual harassment. So Evan, if you could share, what are some of the benefits and challenges to considering SEAH more holistically in UN peacekeeping settings?
Thank you for the question, Phoebe. And thank you everyone for being here today, and to the other panelists for their insightful remarks. IPI has been working to better understand the issue of sexual harassment within peacekeeping operations, specifically committed by peacekeepers against their fellow colleagues, for several years now. In 2022, we surveyed over 400 military and police peacekeepers and found that nearly 30% of women peacekeepers who had completed the survey had experienced internal sexual abuse, including sexual harassment, within the mission. Building on this research, we wanted to then understand how this internal abuse might be linked to external abuse perpetrated against the host community. So last year, Phoebe and I published an issue brief titled Connecting Sexual Exploitation, Abuse, and Sexual Harassment in UN Peace Operations to examine how this link existed or potentially did not exist in policy and practice. And I'm using the term sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or the acronym SEAH here, to signify a link between these two forms of gender-based violence and illustrate that they exist as part of the same continuum. SEAH and sexual harassment can include the same violent acts in different contexts, so we use SEAH as an umbrella term and as the first step towards a more holistic approach. So first, I want to talk about linking SEAH and sexual harassment. Through our research, we found that while many agree that the root causes of sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment are the same, in policy they are often seen as separate issues. This separation can create confusion and undermine prevention efforts, particularly when already limited resources are then further separated. However, we've started to see more policies across the UN system from across different entities, including WHO, UN Women, and UNDP, that now have policies on SEAH and encompass a more holistic view. We found that while there are many benefits to considering a more holistic approach to addressing SEAH, there are also challenges to doing so within the current system. So I want to focus on two key areas where we saw benefits and challenges to considering SEAH more holistically in peacekeeping settings: benefits in prevention and challenges in accountability. Considering SEAH more holistically in peacekeeping settings allows us to view different forms of gender-based violence on a continuum and subsequently better understand why they occur. SEA and sexual harassment have similar origins in that both are enabled by root causes of gender inequality, including the abuse of power. So for instance, in our earlier work on sexual harassment and peacekeeping operations, we found that many of the reported incidents were perpetrated by someone of a higher rank than the victim. And in instances of sexual exploitation and abuse against members of the host community, there's also a very clear power imbalance. UN personnel might be carrying weapons. So that's a very clear difference. Furthermore, SEA and sexual harassment both occur due to a culture of impunity within highly militarized and patriarchal institutions, often operating outside their home context. We argue that because SEA and sexual harassment share root causes, addressing only one form of SEAH may risk exacerbating the other. For instance, recent research from the GSS lab found that strict UN rules banning sex with members of local populations may lead uniformed personnel to expect to be able to engage in sexual relations with their female colleagues. This is not meant to indicate that the zero tolerance policy on SEA is causing sexual harassment by any means, but rather to suggest that there may be a link and that understanding this link can help prevention efforts. So in terms of discussing the benefits of a holistic approach, due to the shared root causes between SEA and sexual harassment, the area in which we thought it was most beneficial to view SEAH holistically in peacekeeping settings is within prevention, particularly within training, which we've already discussed today. So typically pre-deployment training has focused more on SEA, and this is partially due to the fact that UN policies on SEA are more well established, they've been around for longer, and partly because SEA is often seen as an external gender issue, while sexual harassment is seen as an internal gender issue, making it the responsibility of the individual TPCC rather than the UN mission. Expanding the training that already exists to encompass a more holistic approach could help address SEAH across the board. And there are already several robust resources and mechanisms on SEA that can provide lessons learned for addressing sexual harassment, including the Office of the Victims' Rights Advocate. Training is where SEA and sexual harassment are conceptualized and where personnel might be exposed for the first time to understanding what constitutes these behaviors. So it's a key opportunity to discuss the root causes. Now I want to talk a bit about the challenges. While we saw a clear benefit in a holistic approach to SEAH when it came to prevention, there were logistical and legal challenges when it came to accountability. So while it's largely agreed that SEA and sexual harassment have common drivers, there's hesitation on what a combined approach would look like in practice and how it could impact victims and survivors. Individual TPCCs have an MOU with the UN to investigate misconduct within their own forces. And the core pre-deployment training materials, or the CPTM, consider sexual harassment as misconduct and SEA as serious misconduct. Allegations of serious misconduct are usually referred to a national investigation officer, whereas general misconduct is usually referred to the contingent commander. So while there is a more robust system for reporting SEA, there are challenges with reporting sexual harassment, including a lack of an independent victim-centered reporting system that is situated outside the chain of command. And as Becky said, there's reporting issues across the board for both types of violence. Furthermore, different TPCCs have different understandings of what constitutes sexual harassment, and this legal variation makes it difficult to have a uniform approach to accountability for SEAH. This is a major challenge in multinational settings like peacekeeping operations where laws are different between countries. As of 2024, out of the legal frameworks that DPO had received related to standards of conduct in TPCCs, only 5% explicitly mention sexual harassment. However, the main issue with accountability is not necessarily the lack of national laws, but rather their enforcement, and often results in impunity. Versus, in contrast, the UN has more authority to address issues related to SEA, such as the repatriation of uniformed personnel. Another challenge with a holistic approach to accountability was that the circumstances of victims differ and the process for seeking justice varies from outside or within the mission. So a peacekeeper who experiences violence will return to their home country and may have different avenues for seeking justice there, whereas a victim from the host community will remain there after the mission has departed. And accountability efforts should always be victim-centered and tailored to specific cases. I want to finish by looking at opportunities for linking SEA and sexual harassment at the field level outside formal processes. And similar to what USG Saunders was saying, our research found that the role of mission leaders in creating a cohesive mission culture, combating impunity, and establishing social norms against the perpetration of SEAH is key. For instance, different contingents have their own rules around alcohol use, which may help create a mission environment that is less conducive to SEAH. So to conclude, there are still a lot of gaps that persist in this research, including a lack of large-scale data on sexual harassment. Shifting towards a more holistic approach to addressing SEAH would be beneficial for prevention efforts and addressing the root causes of violence, but some challenges with viewing accountability holistically due to different legal mechanisms will likely persist. Drawing on the robust mechanisms that exist to combat SEA can help the UN expand its role in addressing sexual harassment and prevent violence across the continuum. So thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Evan. Last but not least, I want to turn to Aiko Halvakivi. For those who haven't read Aiko's book on gender trainings, it's wonderful. We can link it in the chat. It was a great resource for our research. Aiko's an assistant professor in gender, peace, and security at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I'd like to ask you, based on your research, where have you seen resistance to gender trainings in the context of UN peacekeeping institutions, and how can we navigate these challenges?
Great. Thank you, Phoebe. Thanks so much for the invitation to join the discussion. It was a real pleasure to read the insightful papers produced by IPI, and I'm honored to be in this company. So I've been involved in gender training for peacekeepers, including but not limited to the topic of sexual exploitation and abuse, for the past 15 years, first as an NGO staffer who was involved in designing and delivering the training, and then as a researcher studying it. And I should note that my work has been driven largely by what happens in training at the pedagogical level, and so my comments are situated there more than in kind of broader institutional policies and practices. But so you asked the question about resistance to SEA training, and that's a very apt question. Over those 15 years, in pretty much every training I've conducted or observed, there's been some form of resistance at work. And it's also something that trainers often discuss and exchange thoughts on. But to start out, there are a couple of things I'd like to note about resistance. First, it's not always those who are being trained who are resistant. Resistance to the message of SEA training can and sometimes is voiced by trainers as well as participants. So I've seen many very skilled and excellent trainers, but it's clear that in other cases, those delivering the training do not always fully subscribe to all aspects of the policy on SEA, or they're simply delivering that this session is one of many and they lack the background knowledge and expertise to respond to questions or challenges fielded by the participants, and sometimes in the process end up giving misguided responses to questions. But the second thing to note is that resistance is not always a bad thing. When training participants or trainers themselves challenge policies on SEA, this can be difficult for those of us committed to trying to prevent harm, but it's important to note that resistance can be a normal part of a learning process. Indeed, when we're asking people to reconsider some of their personal beliefs and attitudes and how they've lived their lives, we should expect some resistance. And so some of the trainers that I spoke to felt that when trainees voice resistance, what they're doing is, in fact, they're putting up their views for debate. And that this is an openness that, should be welcomed and should be worked with rather than something that we should try and avoid at all costs. Of course, this particular view applies to debates within a classroom. It doesn't apply as much to the forms of unvoiced resistance that involve withdrawal, refusal to participate, or at the administrative level, making running these trainings very hard, which are all other forms of resistance that I've come across. But I'll focus my comments here on that kind of like challenges within the classroom. So with that said, in terms of the forms this resistance can take, I want to briefly outline 3 common kind of scripts or narratives of resistance to SEA in training. And the first that I've come across is perhaps the most obvious one. I'll call it here the policies are wrong form of resistance. And this is where training participants contest the policy prescriptions themselves. So they might argue that the policy is misguided when the other party is a consenting adult. They might posit that they are in fact doing humanitarian work because by paying for sex, they're giving money to local people. Or they shift the focus from the effects of SEA on the victims to themselves to kind of insist on their entitlement to have sex during long deployments, entitlement or need. And so notably, this conversation often centers around the prohibition of transactional sex or the prohibition of consenting relationships. As we know, SEA or SEAH encompasses a wide variety of behaviors, and it's these ones that are usually the ones that are most challenged. This is less so the case in very clear-cut cases of, very violent abuse that would be criminal offenses in any case. So it's that kind of gray area where a lot of the challenges happen. The second form of resistance I'll bring up are the different forms of the I wouldn't argument. So here, trainees might say that SEA training isn't something that they need because SEA isn't a kind of behavior that they would engage in the first place. Now, where this kind of argument becomes troubling is when it involves racial undertones and assertions of cultural superiority. So arguments I've heard is the kind of argument where somebody will say that I don't need this kind of training or my contingent doesn't, but there are other countries who do. So the association with misconduct with particular other contingents. And another challenge that sometimes comes with this argument is that despite saying that one wouldn't personally engage in this kind of behavior, is then still having a reluctance to intervene or to report when they become aware of exploitative or abusive behavior, which is another variant of the it's not my problem kind of challenge. And so in this respect, training that addresses SEA as an issue for the whole contingent or mission, as your papers point out, or that speaks to trainees as potential bystanders rather than as potential perpetrators is something that's really needed. And the last form of resistance I want to raise is slightly different in nature. So across the training I've conducted and observed, participants have questioned the separation in policy and training sessions between sexual exploitation and abuse of the local population by peacekeepers, sexual harassment committed between peacekeepers, and conflict-related sexual violence committed by the warring parties. So as we know, these different forms of violence and abuse are covered by different institutional mechanisms, and this results in the fact that in SEA training, often trainers will cut off the conversation if people start to bring up sexual harassment, for example, saying that that's not part of this topic. This can have an incredibly invalidating effect if the person who's bringing it up has experienced sexual harassment in their workplace, and it impedes the discussion of common underlying causes to do with enactments of masculine entitlement or notions of racialized superiority that drive some of this behavior. So this last form of resistance, I'm actually quite empathetic to. I believe there's a point, and of course it speaks in favor of the concept of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment that Phoebe and Evan's paper puts forward. So it's also something I've seen across my research. So I know I'm almost out of time, so how to navigate these challenges. I believe they can be addressed to some extent through training, but they also require broader shifts in institutional mindsets and the consistent enforcement of policy frameworks. So I'll just end it with two suggestions. So first, I believe there's a place for training and pedagogy in supporting the development of a kind of culture of respect, a culture of respect that considers the full humanity of others, whether those others are the local population in the peacekeeping area, whether they're women and sexual minorities, or whether there are other peacekeeping contingents. That's the kind of common thread that I see at work enabling this kind of misconduct and poor behavior is the lack of consideration of the humanity of others. And I believe that such a shift would help address the conditions that make exploitation seem normal or acceptable. And finally, a lot of the work of addressing challenges ranging from seeing resistance as a normal process to be worked through, to facilitating difficult conversations, to providing accurate and productive responses to trainees' questions, even when those questions exceed what the formal curriculum has set, that requires a lot of skills and knowledge from the trainer. So I've seen some truly outstanding trainers in the field, but I've also seen many who could benefit from developing their expertise. So one response to these challenges would be to invest further in the professional and subject matter expertise of trainers. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Aiko. And that's such an interesting point. Flagging resistance isn't always bad. It can lead in the classroom, it can lead to real discussions and mind frame shifts. So we're going to do a quick second round to our panelists. I have narrowed down, we got several questions. Thank you so much for everyone joining and submitting questions. So I'm going to allow our panelists, we're going to go in reverse order, a few minutes to comment on any of the questions that they feel they're available to comment to or feel they have a response to, as well as feel free to comment on anything a fellow panelist has said that you might want to pick up on. So the questions have kind of been grouped in different categories. I think the first one, maybe for USG Sanders or Buki would be especially keen to look at is how do we ensure that leadership is committed to combating SEA in the context of competing priorities, such as military effectiveness? And I think that's a question we get a lot. There's been some questions around the culture component we've talked about. Given the different battalions and nationalities involved in peacekeeping operations, how do we make sure positive culture is consistently spread? Maybe this one would be great for Buki or anyone else, but how do we ensure that victims feel comfortable reporting, especially in contexts of insecurity? And then finally, thinking about the abuse of power, how can the UN system better address this root cause and ensure accountability at all levels? So, Aiko, I'm going to start with you and we're going to go in reverse order. So everyone has we have about a half an hour. So maybe like 3 minutes each.
Okay, sorry, I was still busy writing up your questions. I think maybe I'll pick up on can you repeat the question on the culture component?
Yeah, I think the one about given that battalions and peacekeeping are made up of different nationalities, I think that was the question, how to think about positive culture being spread throughout all these different nationalities participating.
Okay, can I expand on that question a little bit? Because something in terms of building on the point I was making around a kind of culture of respect. I just wanted to share some best practice that I've come across in terms of it's more to do with how one relates to the peacekeeping population, because quite a lot of the training is very focused on the peacekeepers themselves. And the local population is sometimes portrayed as kind of a backdrop or as a collection of needs and priorities and rules and so forth. And some of the most effective training I've seen connects with people on a kind of human level and gets them to consider, gets them a glimpse of what it's like to be a person living in that mission area. Whether it's through I was in a training where they showed some graffiti that was found on the walls of Srebrenica in the Dutch compound, and they kind of, the peacekeepers who were being trained were challenged to think about how do you think it would feel to be a Bosnian woman and read this? And we're given much more information of what life was like in a refugee camp at that time, and what people's daily struggles looked like, and so forth. And I think those kind of a shift in perspective sometimes in thinking about, what does the issue look like from different perspectives. And the thing that I would like to add to that, whether it's, looking at other contingents or looking at the local population, is that some of these processes require time. Working through difficult questions that ask you to change your attitude or change how you're living your life or so forth. It's not something that can be made more and more efficient by being delivered in shorter and shorter amounts of time or through e-learning, which isn't to say e-learning can be very, affectively engaging. A lot of it just hasn't been designed that way. That some of this requires more time of training to grapple with these kinds of questions, which I think is a broader institutional challenge. But I'll leave it there and let the other fellow panelists speak as well.
Great, thank you. Evan.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to focus on also the question on positive culture within different battalions, and then accountability and the comfort with reporting. So one interesting example that came up through our research, we spent some time with a mission in Cyprus with UNFICYP, speaking with different contingent leaders and visiting contingents from different nationalities. And one practice that I thought was very interesting for, ensuring sort of a consistent uniform value was that there was one contingent that was primarily made up of personnel from one nationality with a few others from different countries, and they would defer to a lawyer from the predominant TCC in that situation. So if there was ever, a legal question about issues with misconduct, they had sort of that uniform legal practice to refer back to. It was still a challenge with navigating the different cultures, but I thought that was really interesting. And then also the UN has values and principles that they teach uniformly. And so I think framing prevention of SEAH as a UN value to respect human rights rather than a cultural practice is another way to kind of ensure that that positive culture is consistently spread. And then we already spoke also to the importance of gender responsive leadership. And I think that is really key for creating a positive culture. A lot of it, unfortunately, is very reliant on individuals. And I saw that there was another question in the chat about the role of alcohol that I mentioned also, and regulating alcohol as a tool to create a mission culture that is less conducive to SEAH. And in some of our research, we found that that was also very dependent on the contingent commander and the rules that they set. It wasn't really systematized yet. It was kind of specific to the TCC. So that's another thing, I think, an opportunity that could be very important to systematize a little more strongly, but tends to be up to the leader. And so the role of leadership is really key. And then I'll just speak quickly on the accountability and the reporting question. So in terms of our research on sexual harassment, the need for an independent reporting mechanism came out very strongly. And so our research found that many personnel were told just to report to their chain of command, which is not appropriate, especially now that we know that some perpetrators are of a higher rank than the victim. It's not necessarily appropriate or safe to go to report within your chain of command. And so having an independent, external, anonymous reporting mechanism is really important for that. And we also found that a lot of personnel did not have confidence that anything would result from their case once it was reported, which speaks to the accountability issue. And accountability is often left up to the TCC. So we need to incentivize TCCs to report back on what happens and how they're addressing sexual harassment within their ranks. And another option, so there are certain mechanisms that exist, like ClearCheck, that helps vet UN employees who have committed SEA. And so that could also be expanded to mission personnel. So that's another potential measure for accountability. But I'll let the other panelists continue.
Great. Thank you, Evan. And I will read that question. I'm curious, USG Sanders has spoken. We've spoken about this, but curious. Deb Warren Smith from the Elsie Fund said, could you speak more broadly to how alcohol consumption is understood to contribute to risks of SEA and SH in peacekeeping context, and whether this is being addressed in any systematic way? So that's another question on the floor. Buki, over to you.
Thank you. Let me address the issue of alcohol. Of course, when someone drinks, we had a case of someone drinking too much at their party in the team site. And obviously it didn't occur as SEA, but it occurred as misconduct because he started physically attacking the other colleagues. But in the mission, we have controlled alcoholism. For us, it's not acceptable to drink and continuously keep drinking. So we've limited the content of alcohol they could buy in a month. Our staff member is available to only buy maybe three bottles of wine in a month, as opposed to the buying 1.1 million and saying, you know what, we're stressed, we need to relieve ourselves of, we don't go anywhere, we're in the team side. These are excuses, but we did not consider this. We considered the fact that, look, less alcohol will mean less the risk of you committing an SEAH. Because also when they have alcohol, the tendency is that, nobody monitors where we go to whilst we're in the headquarters. They go home, we don't know where they go to. And because they're drunk, there's a high risk that the tendency to commit an SEAH is very high. Because where we are, you can go to a restaurant, nobody's monitoring you. That is where we found that a lot of these potential SEAHs are committed, because they could take anybody to their houses. So we're controlling that by emphasizing continuously through the leadership and through our broadcast that consumption of alcohol is prohibited, excess consumption. So it's something that could be controlled through the leadership as well. When the leader also could show that, look, this is not allowed, when they make the town hall meetings, they convey this message and keep saying to them, you're not allowed to buy excessive alcohol, you're limited, there is no way. Once they know what the repercussion of excessive alcohol is, then they can see that we immediately repatriate someone that has concern alcohol issue. So we will repatriate the person. So we've got limited numbers now. We have not had a case on alcohol consumption that has led to SEAH or sexual harassment for the past, at least the last 3 years. We haven't had that. So I'm not sure if the USG would
Yeah, Buki, do you want to answer any of the other questions? I think there's one maybe you could talk about how to make reporting feel safer. I know that was something you touched on.
Yes. How do we make it safer? We obviously we keep sending broadcasts out that it's your obligation to report. We give them what the consequences of not reporting is. If you don't report, you will bear the consequence of, and we investigate this, and we know that you had information and you did come and report, we will take measures against you. We could lower your salary. There's so many things we could do that the UN has provisions for. Also, we ensure that anytime that they can report to us. I mean, we have a box, complaint box. My office has about 2 doors and is right at the end is in a corner that nobody can see. So that also, we consider that in the location of where my office is going to be. It's right where someone can go in and nobody can see you coming into it. So we have a box. We've encouraged anonymous complaint as well. Anonymous complaints, but we've given them the information that once it's anonymous, please give us where it was committed, when it was committed, who are the parties to it. That way we can investigate properly. Anonymous, you can't just say to me, I saw someone committing SEAH. It just doesn't make any sense, because we're not going to start an investigation without more information. So we've sort of, within the training, we'll bring this out to people that these are the processes. You can do this. You can either report to me, you can report to the SRSG, you can report to anybody in the mission. And people do report. They go to OIOS, they send information, but not necessarily SEAH, because I've touched on the reasons why we don't have SEAHs being reported. The culture, we're limited in approach to the community. We cannot go to the community. We cannot interact with the community. But so those are how we're restricted on those measures. But otherwise, we'll keep communicating to them. We'll keep saying to them, send an email. You're free to send an email. You're free to report. You're free to come. I operate an open office where people come in. I don't need to make an appointment. So the comfort, they have the comfort and the assurance that you can just walk in to the Chief Conduct and Disciplines Office without the fear that, it will go through 3 or 4 different people. And also, once the investigation starts, nobody knows. I have the comments here that people don't know if I'm doing anything in the mission. That's because as an officer, I understand what it is. Confidentiality means a lot to staff members. So it only comes to me, the only two parties that we know, three parties at the point when it's reported, is a complainant, myself, and the SRSG. I report directly to the head of mission. So there is no length of, between all of us. So they're free to come and report, and they do come in and report. Maybe not for SEAH, but we do get sexual harassment come every time. They come and report to me, that's it. And on the terms of leadership, like I said, the USG just came to us. It's given another aspect to what SEAH is, because it was able to take questions, it was able to explain what it is, it was able to explain the process as well. When I go to some team site, I get the military, because the team sites are occupied by the military component. I get the first commander to come with me. That gives them, they understand that the impact, I go through, what the process is, what it means. But the fact that they can see that the first commander is there, the authority is there, the impact of what's going to happen if you committed an SEAH or sexual harassment is there. So the leaders are like, they're the first step to ensure that they have the information, they can give the information to the staff members and the other personnel members as well.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all that experience. Deanne, maybe I'll turn back to you before we have USG Sanders close us out. Several of the questions on there's one I thought maybe we could talk about that we didn't talk totally about, but in the study related to the lack of training in peacekeeping, has the lack of funds and or the shortage of skilled trainers been taken into account? So I think there's a lot we can say. It wasn't necessarily front center in the research, but I think the regional training center emphasis that's something we thought a lot about and how useful they can be. But curious, Deanne, your comments on any of those for a few minutes.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Phoebe. So, unfortunately, with the quantitative data, we can't really unpack that because those questions are not included in the survey yet. But the good thing is that we can include questions like this in the future. That's why we participate in opportunities like this to learn. But what we do know is that we can draw on, these qualitative examples and go straight to the sources, like these regional training organizations that Phoebe has mentioned, to learn from them. We could also go straight to TPCCs who, might have to be where they're not actually sending personnel to a regional training organization, but they, are actually teaching these within their own countries in their own local training facilities. And so essentially what we can do to learn from them is sort of go there and understand whether or how that these trainings are being tailored for different cultural backgrounds and learning styles. So there's like a two-prong there. Like there is the cultural background aspect, but there is also, just individuals have different learning methods, right? What might work for Phoebe, for instance, how she learns might not be the same for me, even if we share the same cultural background. So there's two factors to consider here. And so we need to know more about how TPCCs and, training centers go about preparing and adapting their curriculum in a way that promotes learning amongst personnel from a variety of different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, that is, and also with a variety of different learning styles, which was, in the examples that I gave today with the IPSTC and the CCCPA. Both of those organizations are integrating these practices, right? And so, for example, CCCPA is, carefully tailoring their messages to accommodate the cultural backgrounds. They actually investigate the different backgrounds of groups that are coming or individuals that are coming to be trained at their center. So that's a huge undertaking, right? And it takes time, funds, right, to be able to do that. And so, but they're also trying to integrate these culturally familiar narratives, examples, and values that are aligning sort of with the principles of SEAH. So trying to tailor these messages in such a way that fit culturally, but also fit with the general messaging that's coming from UN and the zero tolerance policy. And also in terms of funding, the Elsie initiative, part of the reason why, we are conducting these MOAPs, the reason why we collect this survey data is for a larger report that is produced so that we can identify, are these issues that we're uncovering or finding, are they due to a lack of funding? And, most of the time, if we can provide or help identify areas where the Elsie initiative can help provide funds, specifically maybe for a training center, things like that. That's sort of where the project or how one of the aspects of how the project is contributing to that. So hopefully that answers a little bit about the funding from
No,
a
that was
from a
really
data perspective.
helpful. Thank you. And to close us off from the panel, USG Sanders, feel free to respond. I know we've thrown a lot at you, so respond to anything you feel willing to.
Thanks, Phoebe, and thank you also to the really interesting and on point information provided by other panelists. I could speak for a while, but I'm going to be very brief. Firstly, in terms of cultures and things like that, I think too much credence is given to the culture business. And when I was appointed to this position, I took a long time to think about this issue and whether or not I was bringing my northern values and frameworks to bear on something where it wasn't appropriate. The bottom line is, and I think Aiko said it, and that is, it's about respect and it's about dignity. And I think irrespective of where you're born, irrespective of your sex, you have the right to go about your business without fearing violence, harassment, abuse, or to be exploited. So I think you have the right to that. And I think when you sign up to the value to work for the UN, whether you're a peacekeeper or a civilian, you sign up to follow our values as set out in the charter, and that's the bottom line. In terms of the alcohol question, I think there's no doubt that there is a link between SEAH and alcohol. And I think we need managed alcohol programs. I don't think a total prohibition works. Although some contingents, like the Irish, they do when they're in operations, they have a total prohibition, because I think people will find it if it's not available. And when they find it, they will drink too much of it within a very short period of time. It could be dangerous alcohol and stuff like that. So I'm much more in favor of managed alcohol, supervised alcohol consumption. It's like everything in life, in moderation. Reporting, I don't think we're there where we need to be in terms of reporting. I mean, there's lots of different things. I think particularly on the blue on blue and the sexual harassment, I think it's incredibly difficult for women in the military and even men in the military to report harassment. I've heard from senior women in the military who have recommended to their junior colleagues, no, don't report it, because there will be retaliation and it'll be negative towards you rather than to the perpetrator. Accountability, I think we have an accountability of victims. Let's never forget that, to ensure that their rights are protected and they get the assistance that they need. And also accountability of perpetrators. We've got to be much better at holding people that commit these acts to account. Training, again, coming back to training, I think, and Martin Griffiths, who's much more erudite than I, said this some time ago, where he said we spend far too much time. Too much time on the urgent rather than the important. And I think we need to look at the underlying drivers and issues which cause sexual violence, which cause sexual exploitation and abuse, and start to address this. Otherwise, we're going to be having the same conversation in 25 years' time. We have to start with children and teaching them about respect and dignity, and particularly with uniformed services, when they join the military or they join the police off the street as young people, that's when the training has to start. And it has to be about equality. It has to be about respect. It has to be about human rights and child protection. And it needs to be repeated and repeated and repeated till it becomes part of their DNA. In terms of the link between sexual exploitation and sexual harassment, I'm really pleased to say that we are spending much more attention now on the issue of sexual harassment. We recognize it's a huge issue. My guess is that before the year is out, we will put the two together and start to address the two together. There is a recent report by the Joint Inspection Unit of the UN, which makes that recommendation. I think it's long overdue, and I'm very happy, and I think we will see that for all the reasons that Evan and other people have mentioned. Then lastly, maybe in terms of leadership, it's 101 of management that you create a safe environment that fosters people to reach their best, whether it's the military or it's civilian. And that's what managers need to do, and that's what they need to be trained to do. We need to recruit the right managers, so we need this as part of the recruitment process, both in the military and in the civilians. And we need to measure leaders on their performance in these particular areas. They need to incorporate risk assessments for sexual exploitation abuse and similar abuses of authority into everything that they do, all their planning, their operations, right down to the patrol that's going out tomorrow to a village that is close by. And they need to appoint somebody within their immediate staff to focus on this issue, recognizing they have many priorities, somebody they trust who will focus on this issue on an ongoing basis to make sure that it is addressed and bring it to their attention. There are many other things, but the bottom line is, I think, Phoebe, is we have the knowledge, we have the tools. Now what we need is really the will to do it. I mean, if every manager, every commander had the will to address this issue, we would address it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an important point to end on. I wanted to also say there were several other questions in the chat we could not get to. I hope we can keep this conversation going in different ways offline. Please feel free to reach out to IPI. I'm sure our panelists would be happy to hear people's thoughts on their remarks. I want to thank our esteemed panel. This was a really excellent discussion. Thank you also to Zaid and Jackie O'Neill. Just to let you know, the recording of this event will live on IPI's website. So if you want to go back to refer to anything, if you want to share it with others working on this issue, please do. And then finally, in the chat, we'll have 2 surveys. One is to share your feedback on today's event. And the second is the one we shared earlier about gender bias in peace operations. Another study we'll have coming out early next year. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you to our panel, and we look forward to continuing this important work in this discussion. Have a great day.